Yeah.
All right, so shall I give you my
Yeah.
thumbnail on this first? So this is about the Daniel Willingham extract from 2010 called "Why Don't Students Like School?" A cognitive scientist answers questions about how the mind works and what it means for your classroom. So I had a good, careful read through this. I've done a lot of reading of cognitive neuroscience anyway, just to get my head around what it's all thinking about. My understanding as a neurobiologist of cognitive neuroscience is it is a set of actually very interesting research, which I think has a lot of interesting information for teachers in, but it's focused entirely in the thinking part of the brain, the ability to measure what goes on in your cognitive brain is now very good. As a pediatric neurologist, I'm for the last 10 years have been privileged to be getting reports from neuropsychologists looking at 14 or 15 different aspects of cognitive function, and with that information building a very good and useful functional picture of that individual's brain and how it works. So I'm a great believer in accurate measurement of brain functions. The issue I have with the drive to use cognitive neuroscience as the only tool in the classrooms is it superficially misses a significant aspect of brain functioning. And that is that actually successful learning occurs because that individual is emotionally involved in the learning process, has been led into the learning process in a way that as a whole person, they are now involved in that learning process. Now, for me, what was really interesting about that, the Willingham extract, is actually at several points in it, he makes reference to the reward system, supporting students to experience success so that they're rewarded by that, but doesn't take the step forward into saying, well, okay, hang on a sec. I keep talking about reward here from a neurobiological aspect. Why is that so important? Why do we keep banging on about this? And the answer is because all successful learning is driven from your emotional brain. It's that controls the dopamine secretion that allows the making and breaking of synapses and for successful learning to occur. So for me as a neurobiologist, my message has always been start the other way around. Start with developing that one-to-one emotional connection with each individual in your classroom. And from that engagement, then learn from them what their cognitive abilities are, and then support them in those cognitive abilities so that they end up experiencing reward and failure and success, but in ways that are in a respectful, self-esteem building environment. So failure is something you go, yeah, well, wow, I can learn from this failure because my self-esteem is good in this. Yeah. My big problem with cognitive neuroscience is because they're utterly focused on the intellect and intellectual challenges and the whole intellectual process of brain functioning, cognitive functioning, you can end up, I suspect, creating a classroom where quite a percentage of the students are not having their self-esteem improved, and in fact, maybe having their self-esteem damaged. Though in fairness to Willingham, he does make the point that you must understand the individual so that you can set challenges that they can meet, as opposed to constantly setting them up to fail, which of course is a disaster. And Willingham does make a clear point that that's what you should be doing, is making sure you don't set people up to fail and understand each individual's abilities. So I think there's a lot in that extract to be applauded. But once again, it's a cognitive neuroscience approach. So for me, misses the point that actually you start with emotional connection. You then understand the pupils' capabilities, and then through an environment of mutual respect and trust, support that child's self-esteem in meeting the challenges you set.
Yeah, and there are some things in there about fundamentally most people learn in the same sort of way, and that take for me there's that issue there about that individualism, that personalized bit, which really counts, because you have to get underneath the individual.
Absolutely.
To know how they work and how they're rewarded as well.
And it's exactly that one-to-one, mutual, respectful, trusting, caring relationship with each individual is where you start, because from that becomes your desire as the teacher to properly understand that individual and support them in their growth and learning. Yeah. But that then becomes growth of the whole person. So we're then moving into the whole broad premise of expeditionary learning and the concept of, well, let's educate someone to be a whole person, not just to do maths. I agree entirely.
And that leads into that intellectual sort of argument, and that the learning that we talk about in our schools is about academic learning fundamentally, and that we're missing a whole chunk of other experiences that can add into it rather than go down a one-dimensional route. For the kids I deal with, there is, and we all know those the impact of trauma and adverse experiences in early childhood and actually later as well. If you don't actually understand and get to grips with that bit, then the barriers to learning is far more than just that one-dimensional way forward. That's when I'm looking at some of these issues around, how we manage behavior in schools. There is, for me, there isn't that emotional stuff in there. They are mentioning it now. There's a lot of words around emotional regulation, but for me, it needs to start. Emotional regulation needs to start with the adult, and we are quite often use it in terms of, well, let's make sure that we develop emotional regulation to students. Well, actually, you need to know how you feel before you get to tackle some of these very challenging situations and experiences and whatever.
And I think not just for challenging situations, experiences, for all classroom environments or teacher-pupil interactions, it absolutely starts with the adult. The adult needs to understand the barriers they carry within themselves, which are preventing the children learning from them, because those barriers are preventing that adult leading each individual forward into their optimized learning. And that's not a criticism of those adults. No. We all carry disharmonies from our upbringing and experiences in life. But if you don't understand those, then they are unconsciously creating blocks to your ability to optimize learning in each individual in front of you. And I agree entirely with that. There's a couple of things just on exactly that I want to pick up. Willingham makes the point or says that we're not naturally good thinkers. He clearly says, even though the brain is not set up for very efficient thinking. I disagree fundamentally with that. In fact, from a neurobiological level, what the brain gets extremely good at is very efficient shortcutting, so that what experience allows you to do is go straight to the solution that's going to work. That's maximum efficiency. So you don't, as a professional, you go straight to the solution that works. As an amateur, you mess around with multiple different solutions and then learn which one works best. So the brain is constantly striving for its most efficient functioning. What he's talking about is the amateur brain, which is the learning brain, is being set tasks that it doesn't have necessarily the streamlined, efficient way of thinking to create the solution to. So I disagree entirely. I think the brain particularly the brain of someone who has trained and professional, is an extraordinarily efficient mechanism, and has the ability to sort through multiple solutions incredibly rapidly and go, oh no, this is the best fit for this situation. Now that seems to me maximum efficiency, not inefficiency.
And it's a subconscious a lot of the time, because like a lot of those things that you developed in your talks and your book is, those templates that we develop are the ones that we don't even have to think about. We don't even have to think about going to get those from our brain. And so much in our thinking is like that. It's we don't have to go and retrieve it. It's almost like it's there ourselves.
Exactly. And sorry, that's what happens with professional knowledge, and this has been studied in musicians and other areas of musicians, most interesting, is that the further into their profession a musician is, the more likely it is they'll use their right hemisphere to listen to music. And your right hemisphere is essentially your Gestalt hemisphere, as you say. It's where you unconsciously grasp all the relevant details and can make and create a solution from. And musicians, that's where they listen with their right brain. Amateurs listen with their left brain. So they need to be thinking about what's happening, so that they become efficient thinkers.
Yeah. There was another statement in one of his principles, that is that factual knowledge precedes skills. What's your take on that? I mean, if you go back to that expeditionary type learning, or
yes,
that really turns that on its head in a way, because you're actually trying to resolve some issues for yourself without the knowledge to do it.
Yes, I think once again this is to do with I think it's more to do with the wording of how cognitive neurosciences present things, because, and I'm quite happily shot down by cognitive neuroscientists that this isn't correct. It seems to me what they mean with that statement is conscious data, stuff that's available to the intellect. But that we know probably 75% of what you learn is data that you collect unconsciously. Because the vast majority of stuff your brain learns is nothing to do with the intellect. It's to do with how to interact in social circumstances, how sand moves from one container to the other, how ultimately you can kick a football or run. All these things are yes, they have a massive data base behind them, but it's not a conscious database. Because if you watch a 2-year-old playing in a sand pit, they typically will pick up 2 containers and pour sand from one container to the other. Well, they're actually learning the 27,000 ways that sand moves from one container to the other. In artificial intelligence research, and what they discovered was that by the time you're 3, you have 3.5 million data points in your brain. That's a substantially higher percentage of your brain than you're ever going to use to learn the whole of academic learning from school and university. They did a really interesting study looking at medical students and specialists. So they looked at data that a medical student had coming into university, data when they left it, and they found they'd learned 3,000 new data items. To move from a qualified doctor to being a cardiologist, you only add 160 data points. So intellectual data items are a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of the vast field of data we collect unconsciously just by doing stuff. So I think it's all data points. So if you want to get good at tennis, you've got to practice hitting tennis balls, so that you do tens of thousands of repeats. So someone like Nadal has probably done millions of repeats of hitting a forehand. And each one has unconsciously delivered modifications to data points he already has. So yes, the brain is based on data. I agree entirely with that statement. But the vast majority of it is unconsciously gained data. It's not intellectual data. And I think cognitive neurosciences are correct in saying it's all based on data. And that data, of course, is manipulating and changing your neural networks, your templates of learning, so they become more and more and more efficient if you're doing it correctly. But the vast majority of that data is unconscious, as opposed to the stuff that cognitive neurosciences measure, which is intellectual cognitive data.
Yeah. And I suppose that whole bit then is, for me, well, the way I think about it is perhaps one doesn't precede the other. It is a holistic again. It's a holistic approach to learning. Yeah. And there's the attitudinal bit as well, which is not in that statement. The attitudinal bit is key to how effective that is as well. And that comes into the emotional stuff that we've talked about.
If you're gaining self-confidence and self-esteem from the environment you're in, then it's going to maximize your emotional engagement with it. So at one level, the cognitive neuroscience statement about reward and experiencing reward through cognitive tasks is in fact correct. For me, the issue is with that statement is that if you focus only on the cognitive intellectual, I'm not clear how you think you're developing the whole person. Because vast majority of your life is not to do with doing mathematics or history or geography or any of those things. The vast majority of your life is day-to-day interaction with yourself in your environments and making that work. So the focus on just the intellect, I think, misses 80% of what education is about. Education is about producing successful human beings who, in their totality as a human, as you've said, can move forward in life in a way where they experience happiness.
I mean, I thought the paper was interesting. It certainly challenged me in a few areas, but at the same time, it is nice to talk to someone like you who's got that other side to it, which and that's what we need to completely challenge all the time in our teaching practice. So for me, there are a number of other issues, not issues as such, but when you tease it out, everything in the paper is relevant, apart from a few challenges, if you like, about some of the things that you brought to the fore there. But if we don't challenge every piece of research, then we don't get the right answers, and we have to look at a wider field. And for me, that's really important. I have to get away from the fact that my experience in working with a range of challenging behavior over the years has led me down a route over the years, which I'm now challenging myself. And it is that challenge that we have to give, because far too many people go into teaching and they learn their skills to begin with. I think what's happening with the new professional qualifications is trying to change that. So we constantly go back to research, we constantly go back to a dialogue with colleagues to challenge ourselves to make it better for the students. And if we don't do that, if we don't open up even papers which we're a little bit, challenged about ourselves, then we don't actually find other answers to the questions.
No, I agree entirely with that. And I mean, my whole understanding of learning and how learning occurs is based entirely in heavy science. But at the end of the day, it's just my understanding.
Yeah.
So it's not actually right or wrong. It's just where I've got to from 30 years of reading that literature and studying that literature. But from that experience, not only in learning and how the healthy brain works, also 30 years of reviewing the medical literature and medical publications, you constantly have to be on your guard of letting your own bias slip into your interpretation.
Yeah.
And, no one gets that right 100%. I certainly don't. So that what my view has always been is all these things are absolutely, as you say, to be approached with an open mind. Cognitive neuroscience, mind mapping, VACing, doesn't matter what you pick from the pedagogy. Read it, but read it as yourself and go, hang on a sec. what am I feeling about this? Does this make sense to me? And if it's not making sense, then part of the question you need to ask is, what in me is rebelling against this? Because actually, it's just ideas. It's not right or wrong. It's just ideas,
And the other thing that comes through in terms of what I'm doing now is what are those really important aspects of behavior? And I say behavior in quotations because that can be dealt with in different ways or even perceived in different ways. But the whole issue around the control mechanisms in teaching and learning are really, really core to how effective it can be with different cohorts, and from a mainstream environment to a specialist SEMH type of environment. And I think it's just knowing, for me, is a bigger part of where we are now is knowing the history that's gone before in terms of what schools have developed from. In schools, and that once that was taken away, education had to then make some decisions about how would you replace that, because the idea of control has to be there. But for me now, it's about moving that area of control around into the emotional side, the understanding of why behavior occurs, trying to get to know the individual. So unless we get a bit more savvy about that, we're going to miss huge opportunities, and I think that's for another day. But it's
I think it's really important, Neil, because one of the core things that happens in children and adults who feel understood, who feel that the person they're with is improving their self-esteem and their self-confidence, is behavior problems largely disappear, because someone who's in an environment where they feel understood, where their self-esteem and self-confidence is high, and where they feel emotionally engaged, they're happy. And happy people, by and large, behave well. And that's a core neurobiological sequence, really, irrespective of the cognitive abilities of that person or other diagnoses like ADHD, autism, and so on. That's creating an environment where every individual in it feels understood, where their self-esteem, self-confidence is good, and where they feel emotionally engaged, creates an environment where behavior is not an issue. Because mutual respect allows you to deal with behaviors in ways that, where necessary, can be tough, but not tough in terms of corporal punishment, but tough in terms of going, well, you're not behaving well. Let's see if we can find a better you for this environment. And once again, what the research from approaches like expeditionary learning shows is that they just don't have behavior problems. I mean, it just pretty much doesn't exist in their schools. So yeah, as you've said, absolutely understand the individual in front of you. Yes, it's important to understand their cognitive abilities so you don't over-challenge them or under-challenge them. But actually, the most important thing to understand is, who is this human being? What are they bringing to this relationship that I'm finding challenging, that they're finding challenging to fit into the system? And also, what have I got in myself that's being challenged by this child and his or her behavior? Because it's in those questions and answering those questions successfully that good behavioral management happens.
You summed that up very nicely there. But it was quite a nice little exercise to do with you, because it just opens up different pathways for yourself to challenge yourself. And I'm sure we could talk more, but I think the fundamentals out of that were really clear for me. Very useful. Thank you very much.
Not at all. No, thank you.
Yeah. Shall I stop that there now? I mean, just
let's stop that for a moment.
Yeah.
And let's see, was there anything else in that in the extract that we wanted to cover? Oh yes, he does think about slow learners, doesn't he?
Yeah, yes. Even when he uses the phrase slow learners, as opposed to students who have perhaps got some sort of other reason why learning
Yes.
doesn't take place.
I mean, I strongly approve of him going, malleable, the belief in malleable intelligence. So don't never limit anyone. Just wait and see what they'll do if you can get them to diligently move forward. And I agree entirely with that statement. And of course, that's once again, expedition learning absolutely is all about that.
Yeah. And interestingly, there are those other bits. I mean, I'm just doing a piece of work with another student of mine who's doing initial teacher training through apprenticeship, which is an interesting one. And
is that you, Andrew was telling me about that? That's relatively new, isn't it? Yeah,
it is. But it's again, it's looking at the research, and they're having to look at pedagogies, and they're looking at Montessori and Froebel, and I've introduced the expeditionary bit, but also experiential. There's a whole area which still is underused in terms of, whether these kids who are struggling to access and engage, that they need to have some ownership of their own learning. A lot of them,
absolutely,
because they don't see the purpose in it, and that's the biggest. That's why we end up with so many students out of mainstream school, because we forget they've all got to do the same thing. They've all got to go in that sausage factory and come out with the GCSEs and in the same subjects. Yes, and we've really got to be bold, I think, and change that around, because some of these families are just totally disinterested in education. They don't see the value in it. Therefore, that's relayed to the kids who just come in and say, well, what the hell, this doesn't mean anything for me. So we've got to look at some ways of turning it around. And I think some of those different not new pedagogies, but that bit where it puts the learning, the emphasis on learning with an ownership with that learner. Yes. But obviously that's a scary thing to do, because that can go anywhere, can't it?
And once again, as you know, expedition learning majors in that the point is that you and your crew own the learning, and the teacher's just there as a facilitator, really. But also, I think what's very powerful in expedition learning is mixed ability classes, because how better to motivate slow learners than have them supported and helped by fast learners. Do you know what I mean? Because for both, it's really helpful, because fast learners are usually crap at putting out their workings. So if they're helping a slow learner, they have to now finally go through all their workings to show how they got to their conclusion. So mixed ability class has been shown to substantially improve educational attainment across all members of the class. And when you think about it, it's obvious. But of course, what does cognitive? Well, actually, in fairness, this guy doesn't. He doesn't talk about mixed ability classes. He doesn't talk about streaming at all, which I think he should have, actually, because he makes some other really good points, which are actually very much in keeping with our thinking, I think. Once again, I think he puts the ribbon of intellect around it, and actually
and that is sometimes one of those glass ceilings, isn't it?
But actually,
a glass ceiling.
In fairness to him, he does actually state, I've forgotten where he says it, but he says about intellect is only one intelligence. There's only one. Because he does pick up on the multiple intelligence model. So actually, to help convert cognitive neurosciences, or people who are becoming addicted to it, to a broader outlook, this article contains all the necessary statements. And in fact, the last paragraph said, classrooms are, after all, not just cognitive places, they're also emotional places, social places, motivational places, and so on. These diverse elements prompt different concerns for the teacher, and they sometimes conflict. That is, the best practice cognitively, maybe poor practice motivationally. So he's trying to step into that thing, but he doesn't, for me, take that last step into saying, start with motivation. Start with emotional connection. Start with one-to-one relationships. Start with mutual respect and good self-esteem and good self-confidence. Everything else flows from that. And not only, once you say that, it's so obvious, but actually all the neurobiology supports that.
That's really, really, really grateful for you spending that time.
Oh, Neil, it's a pleasure.
It's just nice to catch up with you.